You know, it's a pretty darn good sign when a development studio is actually responding to its community's feedback and answering questions candidly, especially in a AAA industry that seems more concerned with chasing down the next big microtransaction to extract more money from us than actually focusing on a good game experience. So Joe Bylos, the creative director for Dune Awakening, just put out a long post on their website addressing some of the biggest community concerns surrounding the current state of the Deep Desert endgame experience. Which is pretty wild, by the way, because the game's not even been out for a month yet and you guys are already in the endgame content. I've got more than 70 hours into it and I've just now started to scratch the surface of the Deep Desert. Anyway, so one of the big problems that they've found with the balance of combat right now is that at present the meta is dominated by light thopters with rocket pods and pretty much nothing else. Which is an absolute shame because there's been a lot of effort put into the FPS combat side of things with the different skills and the way that they play off one another to create much more interesting ground combat. But it's just not happening because the moment you jump onto the sand, you either get eaten by Shai Hulud or you're rocket fodder from one of these swarms of ornithopters. Or until recently, you would just get Goomba stomped into oblivion. Luckily they patched that out, but you're still at a huge disadvantage if you're running around in the sand. And this is something that Joel and their team are keen to address, which is why he says that in an upcoming patch, they're going to be doing a few things to hopefully rebalance combat to make it feel a bit more combined arms as opposed to like pure air combat. For now, this is going to include making light thopters more cumbersome when flying around with rocket pods, which should give the assault thopter variant a bit more room to maneuver and a fighting chance in air-to-air combat. They've also said they're going to be adding in a tier 5 rocket launcher to give players an option on foot to have a bit more agency to fend off these swarms of ornithopters. Finally, they're going to be adjusting some respawn timers to punish repeated deaths, hopefully making victory feel just a little bit more substantial, as in the current balance of the game, when you kill somebody they can just pretty much come back right away and it starts all over right away until somebody gets too tired and goes home or they run out of supplies to use. Players have also pointed out that the Landsred system, while a pretty cool concept, has been a little bit lacking in the feeling of some of the tasks that you're doing. Much of them feel a little bit more like fetch quests than a meaningful player experience. Something that Joel said that they're aware of and that they want to address in coming patches with more interesting and complex content. More immediately though, they're going to look to address some of the issues with squares being completed too quickly, limit stockpiling of rewards, and they're also going to look to stop post-completion hand-ins. For smaller groups, they also want to look to add in some micro daily and weekly rewards so that different scales of groups can feel like they're engaging in this endgame experience. While he didn't say what they're specifically going to do, they're going to be looking to add in things like dungeons and PvE raids to give the Landsred experiences just a little bit more oomph, I guess you could say. Joel emphasized that the future of this experience, though, is going to be player-driven, and Funcom really wants the community to keep giving them feedback to help hone in on what makes an enjoyable experience for players. Joel very much feels that this is a collaborative developer-player journey, something that I love to see outside of a game like Star Citizen. Yeah, I cover that game if you don't know. But the very biggest thing that is going to be changed in an upcoming patch, according to Joel, is addressing some of the feedback from the community regarding what they refer to as forced PvP. And instead of trying to summarize this too quickly, I want to just read word for word what he said, because if I cut anything out, I'm afraid that some of his intention here is going to be misunderstood by either PvP players or PvE players, which are two sides of the same community that he wants to keep engaged with the game. So here's what he said. We want PvE players to be able to play the endgame and have access to the content of the endgame. Our goal is not to force PvE players to interact with a PvP system that they just have no interest in. He then goes on to say that we believe in the core concept of the Deep Desert, an endlessly renewing location that resets every week and creates an activity loop for great rewards. They want the tension of heading out there, your head to be on a swivel, eyes peeled for foes as you enter the most dangerous part of the most dangerous planet in the universe. Our wish, he says, is that players would embrace this loop, forming guilds to work together to overcome the bleakness of the Deep Desert. But as Stephen King says, wish on one hand, shit in the other, see which one fills up first. One hand is overflowing right now, and sadly, it's not wishes. The reality is that players are reporting being cut out of the endgame due to the extremely competitive nature of the Deep Desert. Starting soon, some areas of the Deep Desert will now be flagged as partial warfare PvE, areas where players will be able to explore testing stations and harvest the highest tier of resources without the threat of conflict they might not want to participate in. It's important to note that the top tier of the game is balanced around guilds and groups, so people will still find it grindy if they play solo. Landsrad control points, shipwrecks, and the largest spice fields within the region of the desert will remain War of Assassins or PvP flagged. The deepest parts of the deep desert then will remain as they currently are, high risk, high reward areas. He then goes on to say that the beauty of the deep desert design with the weekly resets and renewals is that they can iterate and experiment with different layouts and setups to really tune the gameplay experience, and that they want to send out surveys with each update to see how people are feeling to get more feedback to help iterate further and improve the experience overall. He then goes into the intent where he says that the intended dynamic of the deep desert PvP in Dune Awakening is that unless you really messed up, you always are supposed to have an option to retreat in good order with whatever you've managed to claim so far. So if you're smart and vigilant, you never have to fight if you don't want to. If you run, you'll have to call a halt to whatever task you were pursuing, but that should always be a choice. PvP should happen when both parties decide that they want to fight over a location. The deep desert becomes a place where people battle over it, over specific objectives, unburied testing sites, shipwrecks, resources focused on islands, and of course, spice blows. Finally, the intended dynamic has always been combined arms. We have infantry and ground vehicles and air vehicles, and they're all supposed to have clear roles, clear strengths, and clear counters. Thopters will always be incredibly important for crossing the desert, but they shouldn't be the dominant force in actual battles. We're planning to make more changes to the deep desert to accommodate ground battles and reinforce the use of player builds. Which I gotta add to this last part is an absolute critical part that's been missing so far from the deep desert. All that complexity just reduced down to throwing rockets at each other is kind of a big disappointment. But I think what the really big takeaway from all of this is that the developers over at Dune Awakening actually care about making a better experience. They're not letting that initial vision of the game's experience get in the way of reality. Sometimes what you plan for a game doesn't end up working the way you think when players get their hands on it. And unfortunately, all too often in this industry, we'll see some development studios just completely ignore feedback from the player base and just go headlong into that mistake until they kill the game, completely dismissing the community as if they don't even exist, which is wild since they're the ones playing the game. But there's absolutely an argument to be made for not listening to your player base all of the time. The reality is that the majority of people who play video games don't care to go to YouTube or to the Reddit forums to post feedback about the experience. So what you're really getting is a minority of players being very loud about what they care about, and that may not represent the majority of the player base. So if you listen to them too often and you don't compare it to other statistics, you may end up making a change that the majority of the player base actually doesn't like. Not saying that that's the case here for this change to PvE and PvP, but it's something that may be the case and that they'll have to investigate and weigh against with statistics and experimentation to make an evaluation of whether or not this change is really the right change going forward. Because there's many ways to approach this. For example, you could just make it easier to disengage with PvP and run away, so that if people don't want to PvP, it's easier for them to get away from that combat. Or you could make the combat more faction-based, where you're fighting against factions instead of individual guilds. There's a lot of ways to do this, and this might not be the right one, but at least what they're willing to do is to experiment and to take players' feedback seriously, which is what's got me excited for the future of this game. This kind of transparency is very rare in this industry outside of, say, indie studios. It shows a level of commitment and care to what they're making, which is incredibly evident to me with all the love and attention to detail concerning the lore of Dune and being true to the Dune universe, even if it's an alternate version of that universe, and how well made the story was. So I, for one, am really excited about these changes. I'm excited to see how it changes the game and if it gets them closer to what they're looking for. And I'm here for whatever adjustments they want to make in the future, and hopefully I'm able to play enough to be able to give some good feedback on my own end. So what do you guys think about these changes? Is this something that you've been hoping that they would do, or are you on the PvP side of things and think that this might mess things up a little bit? I want to know down below. Give me your reasons. I'm interested to engage in this type of conversation because I think it might make its way to the developers. They do actually seem to care about this. Anyway guys, the Coriolis storms is cleared up, so I think I'm going to head out into the deep desert and do a little bit more spice farming. Bless the maker. Hope to see you in the next one.